All right. What's up, everybody? Sorry for having a bit of a late start. We had to discuss some things in advance, get some things set up. All right. So I am here with Craig Biddle. This is a pretty, like, I didn't give anybody any fair warning we were going to have this discussion. So it's just sort of happening. Yeah, we're here to talk about metaethics. It's a pretty open ended. We haven't planned much out. So, Craig, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about who you are, what you do, all that.
Sure, thanks, and I'm happy to be here. So I am the editor-in-chief of a journal called The Objective Standard, and I'm the executive director of a sister organization to that, Objective Standard Institute, which is dedicated to teaching people about philosophy, and in particular about Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism and related ideas for living fully and loving life. So that's I get to swim in that water, and I love it. And I've heard you, Lance, several times talking about metaethics in ways that I think are really interesting. So I'm happy to be here to chat about that.
All right, awesome. For anybody, if they're watching this on another channel or they don't know who I am or whatever, so I'm Lance Bush. I do philosophy and psychology. I focus on the psychology of metaethics. I won't get into a whole background of what I do, but basically it's metaethics and experimental philosophy and the conjunction of the two. And I focus a lot of my online activities on talking about moral realism and anti-realism. Okay, so that being said, I'm happy to hand it over to you to basically guide us to where how you would like to get started. Since you've watched my stuff, you have a sense of what I'm up to. How do you want to start with addressing things?
Yeah, good. So you focus a lot on realism versus anti-realism in ethics and metaethics specifically, and I think we have some substantial agreement, but I want to sort of suss that out and see if that is true. And then I think some of the ideas that I think are true and that I advocate, I think can shed some light on some of the issues in metaethics that I think very few people know. Now, I agree with the philosopher Ayn Rand on metaethics and a lot of other things. I agree essentially with her philosophy, but I'm not here to speak for her, so I'm just going to be telling you what I think. But I do think there's a fair amount of intersection in regard to two things in particular. I've heard you really press, particularly realists, for evidence for their claim that there's some moral fact out there that we're all beholden to. And I agree with you. I think it's just false. I don't think there is a moral fact out there that stands independent, as it's often put, that we are beholden to. And then the anti-realist side is full of alternatives and different ways of viewing things. And I think technically I'm probably an anti-realist in the broadest sense of the term. But I also think there is such thing as an objective standard of morality, and that there are objective facts, and there's just a whole moral code that is factually true. So I think there's an interesting discussion to be had there, because I think there's really a false alternative at play in the idea that either there are moral facts out there, or everything is up to our perspectives and opinions and agreement or the like. But
Yeah. So
I wanted to say, let me. So your focus on evidence is one of the things that I really liked. And the other thing is, you have a use value attitude. It's like, look, if we can't use this stuff, let's not embrace it. And I remember one thing I heard you say, and I don't know who you were having a discussion with, but you said something to the effect of, well, look, if God were real and he came down and he said, here's what's moral because I said so, your attitude was, I don't care what you say. I'm not going to do things just because you said they're moral. I'm going to do what I think is right for me and for my life. I think you might have been talking about like the story of Abram and Isaac, where God tells Abram to kill his son Isaac. It was something like that. And I thought to myself, like, that's a really good attitude to have. Like, if God were real and he told me to do something horrific and that was the moral law, and even if it was the moral law, I would still say, No, thanks. I'm not doing that. And that attitude of yours points to the fact, and a really important fact, I think, that either we need morality, either we need conceptions of what's good and bad, right and wrong, and how we should and shouldn't act for our own purposes here on earth, or we don't. And if we don't need it, then we don't need it. And if there's a God who tells us to do something, we just say, well, I don't need you. I mean, it's like Laplace's hypothesis, Laplace's claim, I have no need of that hypothesis. And so that's what sort of attracted me to your thinking, is the evidence and the use value aspect of this. And so that's kind of where I'd like to start.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, I certainly agree. We may have somewhat different reasons for agreeing on this, but I don't like the realism, anti-realism distinction. It's never one I would have chosen, because I think that the dividing line it draws, like the battle lines between moral realists, I say that with the little air quotes around it, and moral anti-realists, that's not the primary dispute I think most people would be interested in if they thought about the matter, because that dispute emerged in analytic philosophy. It probably existed before that, but it came to the fore, became a central focus of the current disputes in analytic philosophy, largely by centering on the analysis of English sentences. So the sentence, like torturing babies for fun is morally wrong, whether or not that is construed as a proposition, the truth of which doesn't depend on people's attitudes or values or not. And I just don't care that much about the analysis of English sentences, because, the naturalist accounts of realism are radically different in terms of their metaphysics and their practical implications and their epistemology than the non-naturalist realist accounts. They're so different from one another that there are so many ways in which naturalist realists are more like anti-realists than they are like non-naturalist realists. Why would that be the battleground? Why is the dividing line realists versus anti-realists, rather than, for instance, you could say Morians, like people that are non-naturalist about morality and think that there are these non-natural facts out there that we have some type of special a priori access to, versus everybody that doesn't think that. Like functionally, there's not a whole lot of difference between me and moral naturalists that reduce moral claims to a certain kind of descriptive fact. I reject the type of special, weird, ghostly authority that non-naturalists believe moral facts have. So do naturalists. And so this is why, when I frame my objections to realism, I'm often only objecting by saying it's false or unintelligible non-naturalist realism, whereas naturalism, I think, is kind of engaged in a somewhat different project that only looks superficially similar because it converges on the same project semantically, but not metaphysically or epistemologically or practically. And so, like, the semantic distinction is the least interesting of those. Why is the whole dispute hinging on that axis rather than the metaphysical, the practical, or the epistemological, any one of which by itself would be a far more interesting distinction? It's a very weird thing. And it's just the dividing lines speak to the obsession analytic philosophers have with words and semantic analysis. And I think I don't know if that's going to persist forever, but I guess I just wanted to say, yeah, I'm very much, I know I'm saying a lot about this. I'm very much sympathetic to reframings or backing away from the labels, terms, and framings that we use to address philosophical issues, because I think often people get so embedded in them that it clouds their judgments and it clouds their ability to think about these matters clearly.
Agreed, especially when the terminology is itself really unclear. Like, for instance, when people talk about realism, do they mean that there's no fact in the world that has any bearing on what's right and wrong? Or do they mean there's no moral fact out there in the world? Like, those are very different things. And if moral realism means, yeah, there are moral facts out there that are completely independent of our thinking, our needs, our desires, our lives, then I think that's nonsense. And the fastest way to determine that it's nonsense is to say to the people who claim there is such a moral fact out there, is show it to me. Where is it? I don't see it. I see lots of things out there. I hear lots of things out there, but I don't see that moral fact you're talking about. So a different name for realism in that sense could be, and this is a word that Ayn Rand used for this, could be intrinsicism, the idea that the good and value are out there. They're intrinsic in reality somehow, or inherent in the nature of things external to us. The alternative in many people's minds is, okay, if there aren't moral facts out there, then morality is simply in here. It's just in the mind. It's just made up by human beings, or it's just our personal preferences, whether personal or social preferences or whatever. And I think this is a helpful way to think about morality. The idea, well, are there moral facts out there, or is it just all in here? Or is there a third alternative? And this is the alternative that I happen to think is true. And that is that morality is not out there or in here, but it's a relationship between the external facts, including the nature of human beings. I mean, external to the human mind. Like, we have a nature. We can't live underwater, and we have to have certain kinds of nutrients in order to live, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a nature. And the reason why we need to identify the factual requirements of human life and conceptualize them is so that we can live. And morality is precisely the relationship between the mind, our understanding of, that's the in here part, the facts of reality out there, including our nature, and this integration of the in here and the out there is what I think is properly called objectivity. And it's similar to truth, like the difference between fact and truth, right? A fact is just what is. A truth is recognition of what is. And this is Rand's basic approach. And her approach, which I agree with, is the way to think about morality is not to dive in and say, well, which one should we adopt? But rather to step back and ask the question, do we need morality at all? And if so, why? I think it's credited to Socrates. He said, to know what to ask is already to know half, right? And that question, do we need this thing? And if so, why? Kind of points our minds at, well, do we need the concepts of good and value and right and wrong? If so, what facts of reality give rise to those? And this is what I think is missing from so many discussions today about ethics. They get into, as you pointed out, the positivists or the analysts, they get into analyzing sentences and throwing out the idea that there could be any metaphysical basis for anything, because you can't even, in the post-Kantian world, it's as if we can't even access reality anyway. So why would we play with terminology about what's true out there if it's all in here? And so this distinction, and I think you can think of it as, rather than being a dichotomy, everything is either out there, truth and good are out there, and value is out there, or it's all in here. There's, instead of a dichotomy, there's a trichotomy to think of. It's either all out there or all in here, or maybe it's a relationship of the in here to the out there. And that's what I think makes sense to me. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on that kind of an approach, and whether you see that as a way to clarify what is otherwise a very confusing set of alternatives.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would need a lot more details to really assess it, but I could say a bit about how I think about these sorts of things, because I'm not sure where the difference is, if there are any, and I'm guessing that there are differences between my perspective and your perspective would be. So, the way I go about making decisions, I mean, one is that it's largely an empirical question how I do it. So I can introspect and say, here's how I think I make decisions. I could be wrong. Like, I could just be wrong about how my psychology works. People think that, this is a common thing that people will do, is they'll ask you, like, why did you go into that profession? Like, I get asked this, like, why did I get so obsessed with metaethics? And I remember a friend of mine asked me, like, why did you get into the topic that you're into? And I said, I could tell you this whole bogus narrative about how I got into what I got into, but I would be confabulating. I'd be telling a narrative where I'm kind of writing a fiction that's obviously going to depict me in a positive light. It's going to oversimplify, and it might not point to the real reasons that motivated me to do what I did. And so I don't necessarily know why exactly I do what I do. But I can tell you what I think that I'm trying to do, which is that I think that I take myself to have goals or values, and I'm trying to succeed. Like what I'm trying to do is here's what I think I want, and then how do I get what I want? And aside from that, I don't think there's too much. I mean, there's a lot more. There's like devil in the detail type things, but I don't think that there's much more to it than that. But what I will typically say is that, for instance, philosophers, like at least analytic philosophers that are doing conventional metaethics, are always talking about reasons. Like, what's the reason for your action? And if you're an anti-realist, you don't have external reasons. These would be reasons that are not reducible to or constituted by your desires or given by your desires. So you would have a reason to do something regardless of whether it served your interest in any way at all. Now, I think that idea is nonsensical. Now, sometimes people go, "Oh, so you think your desires give you reasons?" And to that, I also say, no, I don't, because that's already doing a kind of wonky metaphysics. Like, I have a desire, and then it generates. They literally use the language generates a reason. What? No, I don't think desires generate reasons unless you're talking in a very loose metaphor. I just think that they're like, when I say my desires motivate me, I'm saying that I have a disposition to act towards certain goals. And it's basically descriptive all the way down. So the kinds of realist positions I reject are positions which hold that there are, the typical phrase you would see would be something like irreducible normativity. So there would just be something that's good or bad or right or wrong, or facts about what you should or shouldn't do that are true independent of any of your goals or values. But when I look at this reason talk, what I tend to say, and it might sound similar, but I'm not sure if there's like a metaphysical difference between your and my view. What I say is, it's not so much that my desires give me reasons for action, and it's not so much that everything is arbitrary and there are no, you could say, stance independent or objective facts involved in the pursuit of my goals. Rather, what I say is there are relational facts. And this is why it does sound kind of similar to what you're saying. But we have to be careful, just because we're speaking about it the same way. Sorry for the freezing. I keep
no problem.
StreamYard is weird. So basically what I'll say is that there are relational facts. So if I have the desire to have a drink, there are facts about would or would not be conducive to that goal. And those facts are not made true by my attitudes. If I I would like to make more money. I don't get to have more money because I prefer to have more money and then it materializes. There are steps I would have to take to obtain money. And there are facts about what's likely to succeed or fail. And those are not up to me. They're not up to anybody. They're just up to how the world is. There might be some second order way, like if someone doesn't want to give me money, then I don't have their money. But there's going to be objective facts about what's going to cause them to give me money. So I have no problem with talking about relational facts. For me, what's critical is that those facts are a type of descriptive fact. They're not irreducibly normative. And so there are these descriptive facts. But then the other thing that's critical for me is that the facts about what would be conducive to a goal will always be contingent on what the goal is. And I think it's possible for people, if not humans, then some AI or whatever, to have pretty much any goal. So there could be like an AI, for instance, that's only goal is to like destroy all humans, or it could have a very silly goal, like it's going to, paint everything in the universe purple or something like that. And if it's acting in pursuit of that goal effectively, I wouldn't look at that and say it's making any factual errors. I wouldn't say it's making any mistakes. I would just say that's very unfortunate that this machine wants to kill everybody and turn everything purple. Let's try to stop it. And that's where I get off the boat with a lot of people that want to say that there's certain goals that you should have or you ought to have, or that you're irrational if you're not pursuing a particular goal. And so, I get a little wary when you start talking about acting with respect to human nature, because, and maybe I'm not understanding exactly what you have in mind. And maybe you didn't say human nature, our nature. I don't know. But I don't know if the presumption is that everybody has the same nature, so we should have the same goals, or, maybe you could flesh that out a bit for me so I could understand it better.
Yeah, I will. And I like the phrase you used, irreducible normativity, because that really is where I think the error lies in the realist side, is this idea that there's going to be some should out there, or ought, or good. And we're going to get to that, and it's irreducible. And this is essentially G.E. Moore's position, right? That good is undefinable because, you know, you can always, there's always an open question. Well, is that really good? So I think that's the problem. And you said that in your mind, it's descriptive all the way down. And here's where I think we agree, but where there's a really interesting way of thinking about that, about the descriptive nature of what we're calling moral claims. And in one of my favorite essays by Rand that I advocate to you and to any of your readers who want to sort of get your head around her ideas, she wrote an essay titled "The Metaphysical versus," actually, no, it's "Causality versus Duty" is the one that I want to bring in here. Causality versus duty, and her that essay is basically about her views on morality versus those of Immanuel Kant. So duty and causality are sort of juxtaposed in here. What does she mean by duty? We'll start with duty because that's basically deontology. Basically, it's the idea that there are moral absolutes that you just should do because they're good. They're irreducible, as you put it. There's irreducible normativity. There's something that you just should do, and there's no way to describe it beyond that. It's just the end of the line. You should. Rand, in that essay, she has a great little story that she tells. It's a 2-sentence story. I love it. She says there's an old black woman, and a man was telling her that she's got to do this or that. And the woman looks up at him and she says, "Mister, there's nothing I've got to do except die." And if you think about it, it's true, right? There's nothing you've got to do, but eventually die. That's going to happen. But you don't have to do anything else. People can make you do things, perhaps, but there's no moral you have to do this or you have to do that. There's no should apart from a goal, a desire, something you want to do. And this is why Rand has causality as the stand-in for her view of ethics. And this goes to your point. There are always goals, and what we're trying to do in life is achieve our goals. And we live in a causal environment. So the law of causality holds. If you want to have a job you love, then you need to look for that kind of job and do the work necessary to create that kind of job for yourself and sustain that kind of a job. That's the nature of the world in which we live. It's a causal environment. And so her view is that, and my view is that morality is not a set of categorical imperatives, thou shalt no matter what, right, which is the religious commandments or the Kantian approach to ethics, but rather it's a series of or a set of hypothetical imperatives. If you want to live a wonderful life, then you have to act in certain ways and not in other ways. So morality is conditional or relative, as you and I could, all goals and values are relative to an ultimate goal. What are we trying to do? And here's where I think a very important point comes in. Obviously, we all have goals and we're trying to go after the things we want, whether it's friendship or a hamburger or romance or whatever. Rand asks the question, well, why do we need to go? Why do we have this need and desire to go after things? What ultimately is the goal of all of this goal seeking and this goal pursuit? And if you think about every goal that we have, whether it's a career or romance or playing hockey this afternoon, each one of these things is, in a sense, a means to something else, right? Like even playing hockey or doing something fun, it's a means to enjoyment. Well, why do I need to do things so that I enjoy things? Does joy provide me anything beyond the joy? Does my work provide me anything beyond the work? And in each case, right, you work, you get money. You play hockey, you get joy. You watch a movie you love, and you get some spiritual depth out of that thing. And Rand asks the question, well, why do we need to do any of this? These are values. These are things that we go after, we're trying to get. Why do we need this? Is there some reason? Is there some fundamental value that gives rise to the need of these things? And her answer is yes, there is. And that value is life itself. Life is what makes values both possible. Because we're alive, we can play hockey and have romantic relationships and have a career that we love. And because we're alive, if we want to remain alive, and here's where the hypothetical if comes in, if you want to remain alive and if you want to have a beautiful life, then because we live in a causal environment, you have to act in certain ways and not in other ways. And then the science of ethics is then fleshing out what and codifying the principles of, okay, well, what do we need to do in order to live fully that way, to live as the kind of being we are? So there's a real Aristotelian element to this. It's like, what kind of being are we? And this goes to your question about human nature. I think we do have a nature, at least a fundamental universal nature. Human beings are the kind of being that has a rational faculty, meaning we can think and use concepts and logic to figure out what's the case in the world and what will support our lives and what won't. And that's universal to all human beings. And then within the sphere of that universality, there's all sorts of optionality. You and I can choose to spend our time talking about philosophy. Somebody else might choose to be a dentist. Somebody else might choose to be a painter. All of those are perfectly legitimate goals or pursuits in life because they actually are life supporting, if life is our fundamental value. And this is just basically a quick brush stroke of the way that Rand and the way that I look at ethics is that it's all about the fact that we live in a causal environment. And if you want to live and have a beautiful life that you really love, there are certain ways you have to act. And if you don't act those ways, it's not going to work for you. And if you do, setting catastrophes aside, you don't get hit by an asteroid or something, then you can live a beautiful life. And that's sort of what her whole ethics is about.
All right. So I think where I start to have some concerns, and I have some questions about this, is that obviously you already know what I'm going to be concerned with. This is the emphasis on life in particular.
Yeah.
So it might help to start by, like, I guess one question I want to ask, because there's more fundamental questions, but when it comes to valuing life, how would you account for, and maybe this isn't an issue, how would you account for cases where a person, say, sacrifices their own life to save the lives of others, or sacrifices their own life for some cause? Let's say a person gives their life to protect like a really important ecosystem from destruction. Like they're not protecting like a human life, for instance. So I guess a few concerns. When it comes to value, ultimate value being life, is it one's own life or the lives of other people? Is it how do animals factor into this? I guess there's a couple questions there. So however you want to take that. Sorry to ask multiple questions at once.
No, and these are great questions. And look, either there are answers to these questions or there aren't. And if there aren't, then it gets really messy. But I think there are. So when we're talking about human beings, when the question of ethics, of how should we act, comes up, we are talking about us initially. Now, this isn't to say that we might at some point be talking about a pet or a cow or the environment or whatever that might come in. But the first thing that we're talking about, and I think I think everyone would agree that ethics, whether it's a legitimate field or not, the idea is, are there certain ways we should act and are there certain ways we should live? Like how should we live? I think is sort of the fair question that people put to it. Well, it's interesting that the word live is right there in that kind of a description of ethics. How should we live, or how should we act? And then if we zero in on why we need to act at all, we get down to a very fundamental fact about life, and that is that it can go out of existence. As Rand points out, life is, as far as we know, the only thing that can go completely out of existence. Matter can be destroyed, or matter can be rearranged, like you can take a rock and pummel it, or you can convert matter to energy, but you can't make matter literally go out of existence. Life can go out of existence. And this fact about life is what makes it the thing that gives rise to the need of values. Now, are we talking about my life, my personal life, or human life more broadly? And here it's both, but in different respects. So if the purpose of thinking and acting in life is to live, if that's what if that's what this tool that we have, the rational faculty is in a sense for, that's what it does for us, then taking into account my nature as a human being is absolutely crucial, right? I can't jump off of a tall tree or a cliff like an eagle and fly, so don't try that. I actually do have a nature, and this goes to the issue of nature and why we do have to take that seriously. Within the framework of human nature, of the things that human beings actually need in order to live, and they wouldn't just be physical things, they would be spiritual things. You're into psychology. I think you have a degree in psychology, right? So I think human beings need self-esteem. If you don't have any conviction that you're capable of dealing with the world and succeeding in life and worthy of success if you make an effort, you can't really function. This is why, you go to a Montessori classroom and teachers are trying to help kids become efficacious so that they can gain that self-esteem so that they can live, right? So that's a spiritual value. By spiritual, I mean pertaining to consciousness, not in a woozy religious way. And so there's a need that we have. We also need purposes in life. If you don't have any aims or goals or things you want to do in life, you're just going to sit there and vegetate. So we need those things. These are facts about human nature that I think are universal, that we need these things. But then if life as a human being is sort of the standard of value, what we need to do in order to live as human beings is the standard of value, then what's the purpose of living at all? Why do this thing at all? We don't have to. People could commit, you can commit suicide if you want. So why stick around? And this is where we get to, I think, the purpose of morality, which is slightly different from the standard of morality. I think the standard is the factual requirements of human life, given the kind of being we are. But the purpose of morality is the pursuit of your own happiness. What can you do within the framework of the kind of being that you are, given your particular values? You might like football, I might like hockey, whatever, or you like, rock and roll and I like classical or whatever. But all of those things are perfectly conducive to human life. The question is, what interests you? What's going to fill your life with fun and joy and meaning? And so in that sense, life pertains to the individual. So there's the sense in which it's universal, the life of a human being, given the kind of being we are. And then there's the life of the individual. Hey, what do you want to do that fuels your life with joy? So it's both. And the integration of the two is, and then I'll let you get a word in here. Sorry to go on, but it was a rich question, so I wanted to give the answer. So the idea here is that life is the standard of value because it's a black and white, actual physical fact. You're either alive or you're not. And in order to, if you want to remain alive, and it is an option, if you want to remain alive, then you are in a causal environment and you have to take certain actions in order to do that. And if you want to remain alive and live as the kind of being you are, a being capable of all sorts of joy and really rich values, then you need to really think about that and live in a certain way and not in other ways. And then on the side of happiness, which is really the sort of the purpose of living a moral life, figure out what's going to really make your long-term life rich at the various levels. And this includes things like a career and wonderful relationships and how you spend your free time, hobbies and artworks you like to get into, and take that really seriously. And so that's the integration of the two. The successful pursuit of life as a human being with respect to your own values is what gives rise to happiness. And the reason happiness can't itself be the standard is because happiness is very much a state of consciousness rather than a metaphysical fact, which life is. You're either in existence or you're not, in effect, at the life level. So life has this objectivity to it, whereas happiness is more of a consciousness level thing that's very related to life, but they're significantly different.
Oh, right. So I'll get to the more fundamental question that I have, but I want to return to to some related questions to what I had initially asked as this develops. Part of what interests me is, unsurprisingly, the psychological aspects of this. You've suggested, and you've referred to this like this ultimate value, like so. I don't know if you saw. Did you see my recent discussion with Alex Malpass?
Some of it, yes. I
Okay.
was unable to watch the whole thing, but I saw some of it, and I'll watch the rest of it.
Well, I'm not. You don't have to, but
Well,
uh, I
obviously,
draw
but it was enjoyable. So I'm just saying for that reason.
Well, the reason I mention is because I drew a distinction. It's not my distinction. It's out there in the philosophical ether between terminal values and instrumental values. So the terminal value is a value that you have not for the purposes of achieving anything else. It's kind of like it's what you use the money for. It's the in. It's it's where the buck stops as far as what's motivating you. So the term for that you could use would be ultimate value or terminal value. Sorry. And it sounds like it's very similar to this idea of ultimate value. And then everything else is an instrumental value. It's a means to an end. And so a lot of what the things people do might look like terminal values or the ends to which there were some means, but they're not. So, a person makes a bunch of money to go on vacation. The vacation isn't the end. They go on the vacation because they want to have fun. And maybe the fun is the end, the joy or the pleasure that they get or the relaxation. But it could be deceptive. A person might go, I'm so stressed at work, I'll take a vacation to relax. And you could view the vacation as they're trying to relax so that they could work harder, so that they could achieve their work goals.
Yeah.
And what if the work goals are not even making them happy? They're just compulsively working because that's what they were told they were supposed to do. Now the person doesn't even appear to be acting in the long-term interests of their own, like with respect to the goal of being happy, or at least they're not doing so very effectively. So what's like the chain between what a person's doing in the very moment as far as instrumental values go and what actually is functioning in practice as their terminal value can be misleading or non-obvious.
Yeah.
But at the very least, well, humans, I think, are very similar to one another. And most of us probably at least have, it's not like, look, I have a background in social psychology, but I'm not like a mega ultra to the max blank slatist where I think culture can just put anything in your head and person could be any which way. People have different food preferences. Some like cilantro, some don't. Some like coffee, some don't. But you're not going to find a whole lot of people that love the taste of lava or like solar plasma or something like that. I mean, one, it's going to be pretty hard to access, but two, not going to taste it much because it's going to be pretty hot. So you do get though people that like eating dirt or glass or something. So people don't have infinitely expansive psychologies in practice where it's more or less random what they want. Otherwise, you would find people outside like, I don't know, screaming or just like doing cartwheels all day because the only thing they want to do is do a cartwheel. You don't find too many people like that. And when people are doing that, we typically presume, and typically correctly, that there's some type of mental illness or something going wrong with the person. We're usually right about that. So I don't think people are infinitely expansive in any and all possible respects. We do have a shared evolved psychology. But there are individual differences between people. So if you look at any sort of standard personality scale, like the big five, people differ in their personalities. If you measure people's goals and attitudes and their moral standards, people have different moral standards. People have different preferences across the board. And so one thing I do wonder about is are you making a descriptive claim about the value, like this is in fact a value all humans have as a matter of like psychologically, all people are acting so as to live, or they value living, or living is the ultimate value that all of their other values terminate in? Or is this like something that they would be like logically committed to? Were they rational? Like what? So is this a psychological claim about people, or a conceptual or logical claim, or a metaphysical? Like what kind of claim is this?
Yeah, really good question. So it's in a sense a metaphysical issue because the fundamental thing that gives rise to our need of doing anything, of taking any action or pursuing any value, is our choice to continue living. If you don't want to live, you just don't need to take any action, right? You can just sit still, and in short order, a few days, you'll be dead. So the only reason that we need to take any action at all is if we want to live. And life in the sense that I'm talking about it is the terminal value, to use your terms. It's the one thing that is an end in itself, fully an end in itself. You pursue things in order to live. And if someone says, well, why live? there's no answer beyond I choose to live. I want to live. And if you don't want to live, then it's the end of the road in terms of actions and values. There would be no reason to do anything. If you said, I don't want to live, therefore I must get to the supermarket this afternoon because the cupboard is bare, it wouldn't make any sense, right? You're like, you don't want to live, you don't need food, you don't need to go to the supermarket, you don't need to do anything. And so there's a sense in which life, and then for human beings, the choice to live, since I do believe in free will, and I believe it basically consists of either, you can think of it, we can either choose to live or not to live. That's sort of the metaphysical element, or there's the epistemological or psychological element, which is we can choose to think or not to think. And those choices, to live or not to live and to think or not to think, are essentially the same choice looked at it from different perspectives. Because thinking is our means of living. It's our fundamental means of living, is using our conceptual faculty to understand the world, choose values that do indeed serve our lives, and then pursue those values. So I don't think that it's a psychological fact that all people choose to live. I think a lot of people choose to remain, in effect, in existence, but they deny or they don't follow through on that choice by choosing to live fully as the kind of being they are, and to live the full kind of lives that they could live if they were to activate their minds and go after it. And we all know people who really seize their lives and go after the things they want and build beautiful lives. And we also know people who have lots of potential, but don't do that. And they vegetate and they become miserable, and they don't love their lives. And sometimes they take their lives. And so I'm not I don't agree with the psychological hedonists who claim that everyone's after pleasure, or everyone's after happiness, or everyone's after anything. I don't even think everyone's after life. But I think if you want to live, if you choose to live, that it makes sense to make the most of that choice, to really take life seriously, to use your mind to figure out, what can I do to just live a really fabulous, beautiful life? And this is why I think ethics is so important. Because if we get that, if this is our ethics, rather than the ethics of, say, altruism or religion, do what God tells you or sacrifice for others, I think those are really perverse ideas. The idea that you should take orders from some imaginary guy in the sky is absurd. And the idea that you should give up your values rather than pursue your values, which is what altruism really calls for, in my view, is also absurd. So I like this idea, and I think it's true. I don't just like it, but I think it's true that life genuinely is the thing that gives rise to our need of values and the possibility of values. And that if we take that seriously, if human beings really got this and took it seriously, we would all be after values that support our lives and engagements with other people that are good for both parties, right? That we would all produce and trade and flourish. So there's when you put it like this, and it's kind of hard to, well, who would be against producing and trading and all of us flourishing? But really, that is the end goal of the reasons we need to act at all, is if we want to do this thing called life. So,
All right.
anyway, I probably went on too long there. I apologize for that.
No, not at all. I want to understand your perspective, and as you're saying this, my list of questions is growing longer than I think we would have the time for you to respond to them in one session. So,
yeah.
But that's the thing. Look, we could try to, like, everything is reels and shorts and TikTok and 5-second responses. I don't want you to feel any pressure that you have to clip your response to keep it within 3 or 4 minutes. When I write a blog post, if it's 10,000 words, I don't care. I just write it. If that's what comes out of my soul, too bad for whatever poor person has to try to trudge through that, because it's voluntary. If they get bored, they could just stop, listening to it. And hey, if Joe Rogan can talk to nonsense to people for 4 hours, we could talk. So don't feel any pressure to truncate your responses. If you want to develop on an idea, please do. Cool. So I certainly don't want to just ask questions and sit here and listen. I do want to give a little pushback. So on this point, here's a potential response I could see someone giving to this idea that life, especially, given that you flesh this out a bit, is an ultimate value. Here's an alternative perspective someone could offer. And I'm wondering what you would say about this. What if they reason something like this? They say, look, it might be true that a necessary precondition for a person pursuing any of their goals other than the goal to live, I mean, maybe that is included as well, any goals other than the goal to live, a necessary precondition to pursue any of those goals is that you have to keep living. I can't go to the supermarket if I'm dead. I can't be happy if I'm dead. And so people could fill in the blank with a million other examples. But then someone could say, but it's not so much that my ultimate goal is to be alive, as that's the end in itself. Rather, being alive is a kind of necessary instrumental goal. You can't do anything as an ultimate goal unless you also have the instrumental goal of being alive. And so being alive would be an important goal because it's always accompanying any other goal that you have. And someone could argue, maybe someone would argue that that's not the case. That's not the argument I want to present here. Rather, it would be, well, it's not that life is the ultimate goal. It's that it's a necessary instrumental goal. What would you make of that kind of critique or that kind of perspective on matters?
Yeah, there's a sense in which I could thoroughly agree with that and not take it as a critique, but take it as a reinforcement of what I'm saying. And this gets back to the difference between a standard of value or a standard of morality and the purpose of morality. So life and happiness are, in a sense, two sides of the same coin. If you choose to live and you choose to live as the kind of being you are, like take for real, take seriously the fact that, look, I've got a rational faculty that helps me to understand the world. I've got an emotional faculty. Emotions are super important. It's not like just because reason is so important that emotions are unimportant. In fact, if you couldn't experience positive, wonderful emotions, there would be no point in living. Why live if life is just mundane or worse, painful or something like that? So you can't really separate life and happiness when we're talking about a human being's life. To be alive is to have needs that will sustain your life. And if you're a human being, you have an emotional faculty and a rational faculty. And the goal is to get these things to work together so that you can, while you're living, experience wonderful emotions, have great friendships, romantic relationships, love your work, love, art that you enjoy. These are all emotional states, and they're really, really important. So there is a sense in which being alive is just a precondition for the aim that comes that I think should come with that, which is to live beautifully. And then when you do that, you experience happiness. And in this sense, you can think of happiness as the thing you're really after. But if you treat happiness as the standard of value rather than life as the standard of value, it unmoors you from metaphysical reality. Because someone can say, well, look, I feel happy when I shoot heroin into my veins and lie in the gutter for the day. Okay, well, that may be true in some loose sense of the concept of happiness, but this is not good for your life given the kind of being you are. There are simple metaphysical facts about what human beings need in order to live as human beings. That needs to be the fundamental if we want to take life seriously, but it's not the end of the road. The use of that decision to live and then the further pursuit of a life really worth living, i.e., a happy life, all of this has to be integrated in our thinking. And look, I grant that this is a little bit complicated, but human beings are complicated animals. We jolly well do have a rational faculty and an emotional faculty, and both of these things are damn complicated. So we can't say, well, look, if it's going to be this complicated, let's throw it out, which some people do. They don't want to hear that there are actual distinctions that you can make between the choice to live and the further choice to actually pursue the values that will make you happy. But I think all of this needs to be seen as of a piece, and that there are differences that are very important, but that there's an integration that also is very important. If you want to live, you get to make that choice or not. And if you do make that choice, you get to make a further additional sort of linked choice to take that choice seriously and really try to live fully, live the best life that you can. And in that sense, that life, that happiness can be seen as the ultimate end, but it is so dependent on life as the biological fundamental that I think it's very good always to bear in mind that is the fundamental, because as you said, you can't be happy if you're not alive, right? You can be alive but not happy, but you can't be happy and not alive. And I think that difference shows the metaphysical difference between happiness and life as standards. And then the aim of really achieving personal happiness in life makes sense, but it can't be unmoored from life itself.
Okay. I feel like in a lot of these cases, I don't know if I should ask a follow-up question or address a related cluster of issues. I think I'm going to go with the second one. So what I want to ask now at this point is, I'm starting to wonder, okay, I can tell you why I'm thinking through like how to respond next. A part of my brain wants to immediately hit you with the weirdest science fiction counterexamples I could possibly come up with. But I have to actively suppress that part of my brain because it's the part of my brain that was trained by analytic philosophers, which is give a counterexample, give a counterexample.
Yeah.
And, it's just philosophers love to say you have this beautiful theory. It accounts for 99% of the cases. And if they could come up with one counterexample, it's this Achilles heel and you're done and everything is trash. And I don't like that. And I feel like I have this pathological tendency to want to do that because you spend years and years having that drummed in your head. So I want to start asking, what if a person turns into a robot and brain uploads? Maybe I'll get to asking that because I'm interested in your perspective on it. But I want to just ask a more basic question here. And maybe this is a silly question, but if you're going to use this term life, I want to get a sense of what exactly you have in mind by that. So I'll gesture in the direction of the kind of science fiction-y stuff, because like life understood as like this biological notion, we might use it to refer to a cluster of traits related to like homeostasis and reproduction and that sort of thing. And I don't imagine that you would take the importance of life to be reducible to like biochemical processes. Like I need to maintain the like potassium channels or like something ridiculous like that. Like I have to have DNA. Like I'm assuming it doesn't have to do with any like human specific, like the minutia of the biology. And so, for instance, why not, for instance, existence? Like existence is what matters, not life. Is life just like a terminological thing that you've decided to hang your hat on and you could use some other term? Or is it like a technical piece of jargon that has a specific meaning? I'm just wondering how you're conceptualizing life and whether it's got to be like, for instance, biological life that's important, or whether, for instance, a conscious android could have values and pursue things and be happy, and whether there would be any issues with that.
Yeah, great question. For now, because we don't face an instance where conscious androids are genuinely, at least not in my view, I don't think we're even close to this, including even AI. We could talk about that if you want. But I regard the state of technology today and robotic beings as simple machines. Still, they're not, well, I shouldn't say simple, they're very complex machines, but they're not a whole lot different for our purposes here than the 1970s TT a calculator that we used, right? They're just very sophisticated versions of that. And when we're talking about values and the pursuit of values and life, what I mean is essentially what biologists mean by life. I mean, biology is the science that comes into existence precisely because there's a certain kind of existence in this world that's very different from all of the other existence, and that is life. Life is something very different than inorganic matter. And so that's why we have a whole science dedicated to studying it. And I'm not sure how biologists would define life in a biological sense, but I think for our purposes, for philosophical purposes, you can define life essentially as a process of self-generated goal-directed action. Self-generated goal-directed action. And I don't think that robots do this. If you have what are those vacuums called? The little electric vacuums?
Roomba?
Roombas. Yeah. If you have a Roomba and you turn it on and it goes around your house and vacuums your carpet, the Roomba is not engaging in self-generated goal-directed action. the goal was programmed into it by a human being. The actions were even caused to happen by a human being's programming. So robots and machines do not pursue their own goals from their, generated by their own selves. Living things do this. Plants engage in photosynthesis. They dig their roots into the ground, they turn their leaves toward the sky. And what happens when they do that is they gain the values that they need in order to keep living. Now, they don't do this intentionally. This is not a purposeful kind of activity, because consciousness and intentionality and all of those things are in the higher organisms, not in the lower. And worms don't, obviously, I think worms are not conscious either. So there's something mechanistic at that level also. But you turn to the very intelligent animals, setting aside humans for now, things like crows and dolphins and elephants. There's a really different thing going on there between, crows and a worm, for instance. And so evolutionarily, we can see that something major is going on in the way that life has developed. And then you get to human beings, and we're just in a different stratosphere relative to the other animals, because we've got this conceptual faculty that developed. And so life for us, if life is a process of self-generated goal-directed action, I think that applies to human beings just as it applies to any other life form. The difference being that we can introspect and extrospect, we can look in and out, we can live an examined life, to put it in Socrates' terms, right? You can take your life seriously and say, hey, how do I want to live? How would I like to design my life? And so life for a human being, I think, properly understood and properly engaged, involves that. It involves really taking the potential of your life seriously, mapping out what you would like to do with it, accepting the fact that things are not always going to go the way that you want them to go, and pivoting here and there as necessary. But we get to do this. And I just wish that philosophers and other people, especially those in charge of educating children, would help children to see that this is how to live. Take your life seriously. Take your mind seriously. Think for yourself. Decide what makes sense to you and live your life on those terms. And instead, we get this kind of skepticism aimed at kids. There's an is-ought dichotomy. You can't get, oughts or how you should act from the facts of reality. So what are you going to do? Well, it's all subjective, or we get it from God, maybe. Oh, great. So we're going to get it from God, who tells us, to kill homosexuals and whatnot. So to me, this is really a life or death issue, the business of getting morality right. And I really do think that Rand got it essentially right. It's difficult to solve these kinds of problems, but it's not that difficult to understand them or to communicate them. And that's what I try to do, is to understand and communicate these ideas. And I always leave open the possibility that I'm still getting something wrong. And I've learned from a lot of people. I don't want to dogmatize and say, well, I got all this worked out and I'm done. But I think if you start thinking about the fact that life is the phenomenon, and it's the only phenomenon that gives rise to the possibility and need of values, and I do think that's true, that really does create a whole new way of approaching ethics in a very positive manner that can serve human beings rather than disrupt life.
Okay, so one of the things you had mentioned, and this was a bit earlier, had to do with some concerns about being altruistic, like sacrificing yourself for others. Can you say a bit more about that? Like what it is that you find objectionable and why you find it objectionable?
Yeah. So this is, I think, really important, in another area where I think Rand did just really heavy lifting. We have to really distinguish between, well, first of all, we get clear on what a sacrifice is. Is it a sacrifice for me to, teach a course to some students and not charge them for it because we give them a scholarship, for instance, to take this course, or for me to give a lecture that I really want to give, but I'm not getting paid for it. Is that a sacrifice? Am I giving up something in a sense where I'm winding up with a net loss of value rather than a net gain? And that's what I think has to be the standard for sacrifice, because we make trades all the time. If you have a banana and I have $1 and I want the banana and you want the $1 and we exchange, both of us came out ahead. We both got what we wanted. We both gained from that transaction. And for me to say, well, I sacrificed the $1 for the banana, it doesn't make any sense. We wouldn't need the term for that kind of an exchange because we already have a term for it. It's called a trade. So why bring in this concept of sacrifice there? I think sacrifice needs to be reserved for the instances when you give up something that is more valuable to your life and happiness for the sake of something less valuable. Otherwise, we would have to call, for instance, Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates the most altruistic people who ever lived because of all of the sacrifices they've made in the exchanges they've made with the products they've sold to people. And we would have to say of Mother Teresa and the like, that they're not even remotely altruistic relative to Gates and Steve Jobs because they haven't made that many sacrifices at all, right? So I think we have to understand what sacrifice means, because altruism, this term was coined by Auguste Comte, the positivist, and what he meant by it was that you should live for others, that you should hold others as your ultimate aim and standard of value, and that you should self-sacrificially serve others. And that's what being moral and being good consists of. Now, this wasn't a new idea. Christianity has this idea. Plenty of other philosophies and religions have held that being moral consists in self-sacrificially serving others. Right? Jesus on the cross is a representation of that very idea, right? He died for our sins. He was serving us, and he sacrificed himself, or God sacrificed his son and himself for that purpose, right? That's what this was about. So if altruism genuinely means serving others at a loss for yourself rather than serving others at a gain for yourself, like a doctor does or a teacher does, then we have a black and white difference between giving up your values altruistically and gaining values by exchanging them with others. Once we have that, which of these activities serves human life and which doesn't? Is it better to produce values and have other people produce values, and then when we want things from other people, we exchange value for value? Or should we all give up the values that would make our lives great to serve other people, which means they have to do that too in an infinite regress? So everybody's just giving up values rather than pursuing values. And in my view, this is the real meaning of altruism. But people are so unused to, and in some cases unwilling to, define terms clearly. Like either we're gaining from an exchange or we're not. Which one is it? It's either or. Let's figure out which one it is. And if you're gaining, to call that a sacrifice doesn't make sense. And to call it altruism doesn't make sense because you're doing it for the gain that you're getting from it. I would say that's egoistic. And I think that's the proper conception of it. If I do something because I want to do it and it's good for my life, and I exchange value for value with someone else, that's good for both of us. That's egoistic times two. But if I'm giving up the things that make my life great to serve other people, then I'm being genuinely being altruistic. And I think that's a really bad idea. Look, I know you're about to have a child, and I have a child who's 22 now. And I didn't want to raise my child to tell her, hey, at every turn, give up the things that would make your life great. That would be morally obscene, right? If you just put it in black and white terms like that. Instead, I told her, look, use your mind to figure out how you can be productive in this world, create things that you love creating, and trade those with other people so that you can live in a harmonious way with other thoughtful, productive people. And this is why I really dislike altruism and think that I actually think altruism is anti-life, because it says don't pursue the values that would make your life wonderful and sustainable, but rather give them up.
Okay. It's a lot. I know I've been asking you questions. We didn't really plan on this being an interview. But I guess I'm wondering at this point, yeah, and sorry, also, I'm trying to get a sense of what you think. You're giving me a lot of material and I'm trying to internalize all of it. I don't know what to make of all of that. So it's gotta percolate in my mind for a bit.
Yeah, it's
But
a lot. Look, as I said, like philosophy is difficult. Like it's a big
Mhm.
subject, and ethics, even ethics, or even just metaethics, to get into a narrower field. I mean, it's all very difficult, and it's a lot to get your head around. And before I pause and let you finish what you were saying, I'm trying to give you a bit of a fleshed out understanding of this, but look, I'm on the fly here too, and my I may not be flawlessly clear here. So if things are confusing, it's partly my fault, no doubt.
yeah, so I guess before well, like let's say a person genuinely like wants there to be less suffering in the world. They don't like suffering, they think suffering is bad, and so they give a substantial portion of their income to charities that are intended to alleviate suffering. Um, that I think would typically be described as an altruistic action. Would that necessarily fall inside or outside the scope of what you have in mind by altruism? And would you find the action objectionable, or is it the reason why the person is performing the action that would make it objectionable?
It would be the reason why. So I regard charity as a matter of integrity. If you genuinely value something a lot, like maybe you have, in my case, this is actually true. I have a friend who died of leukemia when he was 22, and that crushed me, and I hate leukemia with every fiber of my being. So I give to a leukemia charity, a charity, St. Luke's Hospital, that works to alleviate or try to cure leukemia. Well, why do I do that? Because it's of value to me, because it's important to me. Now, if I was giving to some random charity that did not mean anything to me, let's say there was an arboretum near me and I just didn't really care about it, but somebody came by and said, "Hey, would you give some money to this thing that you don't really care about?" And I was like, "Well, sure, charity is a good thing in and of itself, so I'll give you some money," without thinking about it all. That would be wrong, because it wouldn't be upholding my actual values. And if I were to give money to some charity that I don't genuinely care about, it would mean that that money can't go to something I do genuinely care about. So I'm all for charity, and I understand there are plenty of reasons. There are instances where people in this world, either through no fault of their own, are in a nightmare situation, like a child with leukemia, or there are people who were born with, take Down's children with Down syndrome. They're born that way. It's not their fault. And do you care about the fact that there are people who are born with this horrible genetic problem that makes their lives much more difficult than yours and mine? I care about that, and I don't want that to be the case. So there's plenty of room for charity for these kinds of things. I just oppose charity when it's done from a sense of duty. Giving charity is good, therefore you must give charity, end of story. It's like, why? I always want to ask the question, why? Why should I give to this charity? What's in it for me? And this is where it comes back to egoism. But egoism doesn't preclude us from helping other people. In fact, helping other people is extremely good for you in many cases. Think about your wife, think about your kids, think about the people you work with, the people you care about. Um, Even distant strangers who or have good reason to believe are good people. I don't want them to suffer. And if there's something I can do, I mean, bring up a controversial subject, but I'll go ahead and do it anyway. Take the Ukrainian people being attacked by Russia today. I happen to know some Ukrainians, but even if I didn't, I would feel horrible about that happening to them, and I want to help them. And I do in certain ways. I help them. I work with some people over there on a philosophical level to help spread good ideas in their country. And I advocate for our government to support the Ukrainian people with taxpayer dollars. So, that's charity of sorts, but it's self-interested charity. It's thoughtful charity. It's charity that's in line with my values, which is why I brought up the concept of integrity. I think proper charity is really about integrity. Do you genuinely value this thing? And can you support it without it being a sacrifice, without it causing you trouble that is outweighed by the charity you give? And I'll concretize that real quick because that's important. Let's say my child has leukemia and is ill, and there are things I can do to try to save her life. But there are other children with leukemia also who I don't know, and I could give money to save their lives. Which one should I do? If I only have limited money, I only have maybe $100,000 I can put into some charity, and my daughter has leukemia. Well, from an egoistic perspective, it's obvious what I should do. I should help my daughter. But from a sort of a Kantian or duty perspective, to help other people, if helping others is the standard of morality rather than helping myself or the things that are important to my life, then I should put those dollars toward helping strangers I don't know rather than helping my daughter. And again, I think that's perverse. I think that's a horrible way to look at life. So altruism is so muddy because it either means these horrible things or it doesn't. And I think it genuinely does. But if it doesn't mean these horrible things, if it does mean that I should help my daughter rather than other people, and that I should trade with people, and that's the kind of thing that's good rather than just giving up my values for a net loss, then let's be clear about that. And then altruism looks a whole lot more like egoism.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I worry that some people might be concerned that you're offering a somewhat unconventional conception of what altruism is, that they may offer a kind of descriptive account of altruism. Maybe they would look at, I don't know that people really would, because it'd be pretty weird to describe necessarily a person giving a bunch of money to charity as doing something altruistic, because what if they're doing it because they want to improve their public image so that they could continue committing crime behind the scenes? Well, then they're not being altruistic. Or we could just draw a distinction here and say the action is altruistic, but the motivations are not altruistic. But in that case, I wonder, if it might be better to just say that people are acting in a way that is against their own interest or against their nature on this view. I'm not necessarily endorsing this. If they feel motivated to comply with some duty or sense of duty or obligation to prioritize some rule or mandate that supersedes their own will or their own interests or their own values, and that is really fundamentally what is objectionable, not necessarily altruism as such, because I would imagine it would also be a bad thing to prioritize compliance to a duty or rule even if it wasn't altruistic. Like, if you just thought, like, let's say you think there's a God and the God mandates that you go out and you like slaughter people or something, and you think that that's repugnant and pointless and stupid. It doesn't even serve your interests, but you're like, well, you got to do what God says. And so you go out and do it. That seems like that would be bad too, but it's clearly not, there's no, if you're including that as altruism, that would be too much of a stretch of the term. So I wouldn't call it altruistic. Instead, maybe it would be better to construe it as subordinating your will or your values to some external source. That's what's objectionable. Would that be a more general sense of what it is you're finding objectionable?
Yeah, and I do think that really is objectionable. And it's where I think altruism and sort of divine command theory type thinking almost meld perfectly, because it's like God tells you, kill your son Isaac, whom you love. And you're like, well, why would I do that? Are you out of your mind? I love him. He's a value to me. And you're just some bully who came down to tell me to kill my son. Go away. Right. To capitulate to that would be to capitulate to an other. And remember, altruism means otherism. Alter is Latin for other. It just means live for others. Well, the other could be God, or it could be society, or it could be the environment. The other is anyone but you. And I don't think you should live for anything other than you. I think you should live for yourself. And if we think about the meaning of altruism, I define altruism as the moral code that holds that to be moral, you must self-sacrificially serve others. Now, to show why I think that's a good definition for this, what if we said altruism is the morality that holds that you should non-self-sacrificially serve others? So you should serve others, but only when it's not sacrificial, only when you're not giving up something to do that. In other words, you're gaining or at least breaking even on the thing. Altruism would lose its meaning if it were defined that way, because that's genuinely not what the morality is about. Comte coined the term altruism to capture a thing that already existed, and that was this idea that being moral consists in self-sacrificially serving others. We need a term for that idea because it actually exists. And then we need to take that terminology seriously and say, all right, so if you're helping others or treating others in a way that renders you with a net gain, which I do with my wife and my daughter and my, in work environment and all that all the time, it's wrong to call that altruistic because I'm not losing in those exchanges. I'm gaining. So that's egoistic. So I think it's really important when we're thinking about altruism to not go with what I think is a package deal in that term today. A lot of people hold altruism as two things in the same package, but that don't go together. Anytime you help other people in any way, or you're kind or benevolent or nice to people, so that's one way, plus giving up your values in service of others in a way that renders you a net loss. These should not be packaged together under one concept, these two things, because they are fundamentally different. What Jeff Bezos does in trading with people to gain the values that he gains is very different from from a Mother Teresa type whose MO is to say, I'm going to do things for others when I get nothing in return. And in fact, my life is made miserable by doing it. And that's essentially what Mother Teresa did. Now, that is real altruism in my view. Now, if somebody wants to go on and say, well, she was really an egoist because she wanted to get into heaven, so she was aiming at this higher thing, we could talk about that. But in my view, the idea that you're going to go to heaven is just an irrational view because there's no evidence to support that. So I wouldn't go there. But I also think if you were to tell Mother Teresa that she was the world's most pronounced egoist, that she would look at you like you had three heads, right? Because that certainly was not her intention to be an egoist. Whereas if your aim is to be productive and make money and build a life you love, we need a term for that too. We need a term for taking that intention very seriously and doing that thing. And the term for that, I think, is rational egoism. And the rational has to be in there because otherwise you get the Hobbesian type egoist or the Nietzschean type egoist who are just like, well, do whatever you want to do to other people. I think if you use your mind and you think about what it means to be a human being and what a really beautiful life consists of, and you plan and act accordingly, we need a term for that kind of an MO. And that term is rational egoism. We need a term for people who just act on whatever gives them pleasure. We have that term, hedonism. We need a term for people who take seriously the idea that you should act in a self-sacrificial manner to help other people. And I think that's altruism. And we got to be clear on that, because if you make it one big package that puts Jeff Bezos and Mother Teresa and Michael Dell and you and me all in the same package, the package loses meaning.
Okay, so if it's wrong to be altruistic in the sense you've specified, would it also be wrong for a person to not be generous or kind to the people around them? So, let's say I independently earn my wealth of my own accord. I didn't steal. I didn't lie. I started a business or something like that. I become independently wealthy, and I live in a golden mansion, and I'm surrounded by slums. And let's say I just don't care about the people there. I see them starving. I see they're dying. I know they're ill. I know exactly what I could do to help them. And it wouldn't even necessarily have to be showering them with money. I could like make the municipal water supply safe and clean for people. I could, you know, not use all the tax loopholes I'm using to get out of paying taxes or whatever. I could, you know, whatever it would be, I could help them. And let's say I just don't want to because I don't care if they die. And I don't necessarily think, you know, they got to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and I'm being tough minded. I genuinely just don't care about those people. I got my family, I got my friends. We throw big lavish parties. We have a big feast while they're outside the walls dying. Is that person doing something immoral when they do that?
So this is so contextual because if you just paint a picture of a guy with lots of money and people outside a wall dying, and you know he says I don't care, you know, about them at all, that looks really ugly. But let's paint it. Let's put it in more realistic terms, right? So here I am. I live in Southern California, and I have a reasonable income, and I live a nice life, and I give to some charities that I think are important to me. But I'm well aware that there are people dying across the globe. And there are people in Africa who are dying of malaria, and there are, you know, people starving in certain places in the world. And I'm aware of that. And I'm aware that if I were to give some of my income to certain charities, that it would make it to some extent to those people and might in some way save lives there. So this is of course what gave rise to the effective egoism, effective altruism community, right? Is this idea that, well, if you're going to be really moral, you have to take altruism seriously. And the best way to do that is to earn a lot of money and then give it to charities that go save people around the world. I think that's a corrupt way to think about morality and your values. I don't think we have any moral duty to be chasing or, you know, finding out everyone who's suffering on the planet and doing everything we can to stop their suffering, unless we're going to do that at a fundamental level. And that is to advocate a philosophy and a moral code that can eradicate those kinds of problems. And I believe that the philosophy and moral code that I advocate actually does that. So I think if people want to save lives all around the world of people who are suffering and dying, the best way to do that is to uphold a morality of reason, rational egoism, free markets, trade, and prosperity, which rises, and we've seen this over the past 200 years. You know, the standard of living curves go, you know, it went like this for thousands and thousands of years, and then it went like that. Why? Because people started using reason, and because freedom became a more regular thing, and the combination of those two things brought us this prosperity that we have. So I think if you really care about people who are starving, the way to handle that is not to just throw money at strangers and through organizations that are going to take a large portion of that money, you know, to pay their big salaries and this, that, and the other, but rather take seriously the business of helping human beings understand a moral code and a philosophy that could rise the entire planet into the kind of life that we have here in the United States. Now, back to the sort of micro version of your question. So if someone is very well off and he has lots of money and he knows that other people are starving and have problems, does he have a moral duty to serve them? And is he being immoral if he doesn't? I don't think he's being immoral if he doesn't. I think in an emergency situation, if it's right there at your door, you know somebody's out, you know, if a child is drowning in a puddle and you're on your way to a job interview and you have on a nice suit, I think it would be absolutely immoral to say, well, I'm not going to help the child because I get my suit dirty. And of course, I'm an egoist and I wouldn't want to miss my job interview. That's obscene. And it's also not thoughtful. That would not be rational egoism. That would be context dropping to the max. The idea that a child's life is worth less than your suit or a phone call to the job interview. Hey, I just was on my way to the job interview, but I had to save a child who was drowning, right? Obviously, you're going to do that. And that's the thoughtful, rational, egoistic thing to do in that context. So I really think it's important not to and I know you're sensitive to this, and I'm not, I'm not saying, you're creating this this horrible context that tries to wipe out everything that I've said. But I think that does happen a lot. Those kinds of examples will come up, and I think the answer to them is morality is local in a certain regard. It's about your life, your values, and the people and situations that you encounter. And you should take that stuff seriously. If you value helping students in a certain school and you have the means to support that school, and that's in your value hierarchy, you should do that. And if you don't, you're acting like a hypocrite because you value it, yet you're not acting on the value that you actually uphold. At the same time, if you know that people are starving across the globe and you give all your money up to send money to them, and you make your life awful, that is not egoistic. That's not good for your life. And frankly, it's not even good for their lives, because the best way to save people's lives is not to shower them with money, but to create a philosophical framework that changes the way that human beings do things, so that we don't have theocracies, lording it over people and making life miserable. And we don't have communist dictatorships lording it over people and making their lives miserable. If you want to do really wholesale help for this world, in my view, the thing you should do is advocate rational, life-serving philosophy.
Yeah, I do wonder, if that's the broad goal that a person has, and they're like, look, I'm not going to just like fork over my life's earnings to help the people right outside my door because there's better long-term ways to help people. I could see someone potentially having that sort of perspective. And you did mention like, something like Singer's drowning pond scenario. But there's a vast territory between an urgent, immediate crisis where there's a person that is like a child drowning in a pond and you're the only person around and you're the only person that could save them. And I could ask some questions about that, like what would be wrong about leaving the person and just going about like keeping your suit. But there's like, if the people are starving outside your walls, you wouldn't be in a position plausibly to start like teaching them philosophy and have that have some immediate impact, because if I'm teaching a person and they're sitting there going, I can't remember, I'm too hungry, that person's not going to benefit from me like handing them a copy of Atlas Shrugged. They need food.
And I didn't mean to say that rather than give the starving person outside the door food, give him a book. But I get your point. And look, we're not faced with starving people outside our doors. We genuinely are not. What we are faced with is a planet where not everyone has the kinds of resources and abilities that you and I have. And I'd like them to have those. So I think advocating rational ideas is the best way to do that kind of work long-term and at large scale. And I also think that taking your value hierarchy and your integrity seriously locally makes a big difference. If you hate leukemia as much as I do, give money to research that is trying to eradicate leukemia. If you think that helping young girls get into STEM studies so that they can rise and have wonderful lives and be independent young women, if that's important to you and you want to give some money to a charity that supports that kind of thing, then you should do that. And if you value it and don't do it, you're being a hypocrite. And so there's nothing anti-charity here. It's just that you don't have a moral obligation to go out and save everyone who's suffering on this planet. In my view, your moral obligation, which is a chosen obligation, it's not a duty from on high. It's, hey, I want to live a great life and uphold my values. So I got to figure out what they are. And then I want to take that value hierarchy seriously. If these things are really important to me, then I'll give money to support them. And by the way, in America, you probably know this, but not a lot of people do. Americans give about $400 billion a year to charity. That's like 2% of the GDP. That's a lot of money. Now, a lot of that, I think, does come from churches and organizations, but a lot of it also comes just from individuals who are like, hey, I think this charity is really important and I want to give some money to it. And this is a natural phenomenon, I think, in human beings, that we have this thing called empathy, right? We have empathy and sympathy. We can project and feel other people's pain in some regard. And we care about a lot of things. And a lot of people put their money where their values are. Now, some people don't. And there definitely will be some people who are like, yeah, sure, I care about all those things, but I'm not going to give a penny to any of them ever. Okay, I think you're a hypocrite. If you really cared about them, you would support some of these things that you claim to care about. But if you don't, fine. I don't think you're being honest with yourself. So I just think charity is an issue. It's an important issue, and it's a matter of integrity. But if you think about it, the number of people, the percentage of people, I shouldn't say number, the percentage of people who genuinely cannot help themselves through no fault of their own is very small. It's essentially, people born with Down syndrome or people who are in accidents and, have brain damage because of it. I mean, even a Stephen Hawking can be relegated to a wheelchair for his life, yet do really important work. Why? Because productive work is really centered in the mind. Ultimately, it's, if you can use your mind, you can be productive in some sense. And the instances overseas and in many places where people really are suffering in mass, the reason for that is the really bad ideas and the really bad governments in those areas. It's not because you and I aren't sending them money. It's because they have horrible ideas and horrible governments. Take Iran. Iran is this place where, some of the people there are rational and want to live in a Western sort of free kind of way. But you have these mullahs in this regime tyrannizing everyone, making women, live in bags, and hanging homosexuals for expressing, their love to their lover. This is just horrible. And what those people need is not money. They need freedom. They need good ideas, and they need to be freed from this wretched dictatorship. So I think the big work. I'm all for helping people. My career is helping people. That's what I do. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we should self-sacrificially help people. I think we should help people in ways that are good for us.
Yeah, let me be clear about what I'm driving at with the question. So, and I'll put this in a broader context. So for many years, I called myself a utilitarian. And if I haven't officially said this, I don't think of myself as a utilitarian anymore. But one of the things that you encounter when you defend utilitarianism is people will ask you questions like, well, what if torturing a small group of people is the only way to maximize utility? Or what if you had to set babies on fire to maximize utility? People can come up with outrageous and contrived scenarios, or they could even come up with somewhat plausible scenarios, like, torturing someone to locate a bomb that they planted or something. I think something like that maybe has happened. And these are often leveraged to try to depict the utilitarian as an evil monster if they, quote unquote, bite the bullet and say, yeah, I would be okay with torturing a person in that scenario. Like, you could give someone a very silly one, like, imagine aliens show up and they say, we're going to torture everyone on the planet unless you torture this one person, that if you don't torture them, we will torture that person plus everybody else. Well, a utilitarian is going to say, yeah, you should probably torture the person. Sucks, but it's going to lead to less torture overall. And you're not even saving the person. Now, that can be leveraged to say, oh, so you're okay with torturing everybody. Or sorry, you're okay with torturing people.
Yeah.
I don't like that. I don't like when people try to imply a position is bad because of some obvious entailment of the position that can be leveraged rhetorically to frame the position. Because someone could just run off going, Lance is pro-torture, Lance is pro-torture. So I'm not trying to do that. What I'm trying to, I'm not suggesting you're against charity, or that if someone who shares your view, that they're like, everybody is like everybody that is into this perspective, like a objectivist perspective on these things, is like a Scrooge McDuck that's like, leave me alone. I'm only gonna sit here and I don't know, eat filet mignon and on my golden throne and watch the peasants starve. Not at all. What I am wondering is, not that is the depiction that would be stereotypically associated with the view, because a person could really value helping other people and help them, or a person could be really interested in innovation and they innovate in ways that are beneficial to the people around them. But it does seem, at least I'm not seeing the tools within the framework to rule out if a person was a Scrooge McDuck or just a selfish jerk, that they're doing anything wrong by just going, yeah, I just don't care about those people. Like, yeah, there's better ways for them to live, but they could think that the best way for those people to live is to figure it out themselves. Like they're all really, really, really about self-discovery. And so if the people outside the wall are starving, too bad. Maybe that's just the way that things should go. Do you have the resources to find that attitude objectionable? I mean, keep in mind, I'm saying this as an anti-realist. So
no,
as
and
a
I get
moral
it.
anti-realist, as a moral anti-realist, I don't think someone that is like going around like eating everybody, like if aliens show up and they're eating all the humans, I would not say they're objectively wrong. I oppose. I would say I don't like what they're doing. Let's go stop the aliens from eating everybody. But I don't think they're making factual mistakes, and people frequently leverage that to imply I'm evil. So I'm not trying to suggest that the view is evil in some objective sense, or that it allows evil in some objective sense. I'm trying to get a descriptive sense of if a person was a genuinely just screw other people, I don't care about them. On your view, would that person be an immoral person or a bad person or something like that?
Only in the sense that if he came to those conclusions and developed that character by non-thinking, by being irrational, by evading, by ignoring things he knows to be true. Like, for instance, let's say he does sense on some level that he cares about certain other people, maybe family members or people that are in his neighborhood or whatever. And he pushes that out of his mind to be like, no, I just want to focus on my money, so I'm going to ignore these ideas that are seeping into my head now. That is called evasion, right? That's pushing out of your mind things that are relevant. Whether they're true or not is another matter, because you're not going to know unless you investigate them. But pushing things out of your mind when you sense that they're relevant is an act of evasion. And I think that's the fundamental vice that human beings can engage in. And the reason is that reason, the active use of reason to figure out what's true in this world, is our fundamental means of living. So the opposite of that, evasion, not doing that thing, is bad for you and bad for your life. So if someone takes the position, I don't care about anyone at all, I'm just going to, amass piles of money and do what I want to do with my money, and that's that. He has every right to do, has every moral right to do that. No one should be able to stop him from doing that. But that doesn't mean that we can't look at him and say, I think you live a really thoughtless life. I don't think you're thinking about your life and your values clearly at all. You can protest that you are, and that doesn't change the fact that I don't think you are. And my judgment of you for being thoughtless is that you're acting immorally. But that's as far as it goes, because you're free to act immorally. You have a moral right to act immorally as long as you do not initiate physical force against other people. We haven't talked about rights yet, but there's a whole theory of rights tied to these ideas that I'm talking about. I wrote a long essay on this titled Ayn Rand's Theory of Rights that gets into that. But people have a moral right to do what, in my view, to do whatever they want with their lives, as long as they do not initiate physical force against other people, whether directly or indirectly. Say fraud would be indirect, because their life belongs to them. And if somebody wants to live that way, he's welcome to live that way. Legally speaking, he should be welcome to live that way. But that doesn't mean I can't judge him negatively. I think that drugs should be legal. I think even for recreational purposes. And I don't have anything against people using recreational drugs if they do so rationally. But if I see somebody using drugs, even alcohol, irrationally, my judgment of them is you're being irrational, and that's immoral because it's anti-life. It's anti-your life. So I have no problem with judging someone in the scenario that you're painting here. And I can judge him immorally or more as immoral or moral, depending on the context. But as long as he's not using force against people, I would maintain, even if I judge him negatively, that he has a moral right to live that way.
Okay. I feel like I've been asking you a bazillion trillion questions. So if you want to shift here, I don't know how much time you want to take, but I probably want to wrap up in the next 20 minutes. Past 2 hours is too much.
Yeah. I unfortunately have another meeting I have to get to in 9 minutes. I didn't realize how late
Okay.
it had gotten. But
Yeah.
let's do this, because I wouldn't want to start getting into a whole nother series of subjects now that we would then have to cut short. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I know you were asking questions and I was kind of doing more of the talking. This was very spontaneous between the two of us. We didn't have a plan for what we were going to do. But I enjoyed this, and I would love to plumb your mind for your thoughts on these things more than we did here. So let's do this again.
Yeah, so let's do this, and if you want, we could do this on your channel, and you could cross-examine me, and I could sit in the hot seat. And like, we didn't plan this, so I didn't plan on, like, it just one question led to another, so I just had a bunch of questions, and I just figured, what the heck? Why don't you flesh out your view? So let's do that. If you want to do it that way, you could kind of cross-examine me, or we could just have it open-ended, however you want. But I don't
would
want you to
love
feel
do
like
that. I think it would be fun to do it that way. It'll
Cool.
be somewhat open-ended anyway. Just, I mean, this is obviously hardly a structured conversation, and I don't think that needs to be either. But that can be the gist of it: is that I'll question you, and we'll get into your thoughts on things. That would be great. Now, I know you're about to have a baby and go into that sphere of life for a while, so I'm not sure what the timing will be on this, but we can communicate that afterward.
Yep, we could figure it out after that. And I'm sure if you have a meeting in a few minutes, it'd be good to have a little break before that. So why don't we
It
wrap
would.
things up here? If we had infinite time, I would say, hey, let's go to the audience and ask them some questions. But if you're cool with it, we'll wrap it up there. Any last words? And then I'll just go to like my final thing before I close things out.
Nothing for today, other than thanks. This was a lot of fun, and I love chatting ideas with you.
Great. Okay. All right. So everybody in the chat, sorry we didn't, normally I get really chatty with the chat, but I felt like it would make more sense to focus on our conversation. So sorry, everybody. If you were the first, second, and third person in the chat, then you get your Lance loot, as is typical for my channel. Because this was hosted on my channel, I get to do that. And then do all the standard things: like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave comments in the comment section. I'm trying to start a new thing, which is that whatever I consider my favorite comment, I'm going to pin it so it gets to the top. So we're going to try to remember to do that. So do leave comments in the comment section. And Craig, if you have links, you could email those to me and I could post them in a description of the video. They're not up yet, so I could add those for people to find you. And as always, for everybody that does leave a comment, don't leave rude, obnoxious, or toxic comments on my channel or any other channels. Like if I'm reviewing somebody's video, please don't do that. I don't want to like review a video, and not that I'm doing it this time, but I'm trying to get the word out. I don't want people to go to other people's channels and be like, I saw this after Lance showed it to me and you're a big dumb idiot. And people do stuff like that. Please don't do that. All right, everybody. So just don't be a jerk on the internet. All right, everybody. Take care. I will see you all later.